Hello and welcome everyone. Today we are going to start with a new thinker, Immanuel Kant. And on Kant also we are going to have 3 lectures. So in the lecture today we will focus on his brief bio sketch or personal life, his intellectual context and also his views on enlightenment. So Kant is a quintessential enlightenment thinker who believed that the reason and rationality should guide our action. That means the use of reason and rationality will create a society which would be enlightened and progressive. So Kant joined a group of thinkers who argued about how to achieve enlightenment, both at the individual level and also at the level of society or the community, and how to create peace, order in the society by using reason and rationality, which would be the basis of all kind of knowledge and also would shape the actions of individual. So in this lecture today we are going to focus on his views on enlightenment. In the second lecture we also discuss how he connects this idea of reason, rationality to the question of freedom, morality and autonomy. And in the concluding lecture on Kant, we will focus on his views on kingdom of ends, dignity, perpetual peace, before looking at the critical assessment of Kant's political philosophy or political thought. So that would be our division of lectures on Kant. Now we will start with today's lecture, where Kant appears to be a kind of quintessential figure of enlightenment and a representative thinker of German idealism. And German idealism was a well developed school of thought within continental philosophy, which believes in the primacy of ideas and how ideas shapes human actions or determines all social collective actions in the society. So Kant is a representative thinker of that school of thought which we call German idealism, which is different from materialism or the practical thinking that is there in England. So he remains a quintessential enlightenment figure. So when we talk about reason and rationality, immediately Kant comes to our mind, and it becomes a kind of synonymous with Kantian ethics, views on philosophy, epistemology and metaphysics. So Kant remains a quintessential figure of enlightenment, and enlightenment is something which gives primacy to reason and rationality as a source of knowledge and also something that shapes or guides human action. And Kant is a kind of synonymous figure with that modes of thinking and also a representative thinker of German idealism. Kant had a tremendous influence on the 19th century continental philosophy. So after Kant, it was necessary for every thinkers to read his philosophy and engage with his philosophy. Whether they accept or challenges, that is different thing, but Kant had a kind of tremendous influence on the subsequent generation of philosopher throughout the continent. So his major objective or primary concern was to understand what is called the limits and functioning of human knowledge. So in enlightenment it was believed that knowledge is power, so to say, Francis Bacon. Now what should be the source of knowledge, how it operates and what we can know and what remains which we cannot know. So there would be things in itself which is very difficult for human being to understand. What we understand is guided by our sensation, our sense perception, our cognitive ideas and so on. So, Kant's primary objective in many of his writings is to understand the limits and the functioning of knowledge, what we can know, how we should know it, and what are the limits to our knowing. That remains the primary concern of many of his philosophical treatises. His philosophy influenced the works of Schopenhauer, Hegel, Herder and many others continental philosophers. And it is said that to be a philosopher one has to be Kantian, and Schopenhauer used to say that all men are child unless he read or understood Kant. So, Kant has that kind of determining influence on continental philosophy. He was a quintessential Enlightenment thinker who emphasized on the public use of reason. And what does he mean by this public use of reason? We will discuss in a minute when we will discuss Kantian views on enlightenment. So, here it is necessary to understand that for Kant, a kind of quintessential enlightenment thinker, reason and rationality is the basis of knowledge. However, what do we mean by knowledge, or in other words, what are the limits of the knowledge, that one also need to engage with or analyze, and that remains the major concern of Kant. In his philosophy, he combined the ideas like freedom, morality and autonomy. So, he combined all of these three together, and in doing so he is guided by a kind of Rousseau's approach to freedom and how one exercise freedom by engagement in the public life of the community by following the general will, which is self-legislated. So, when we will discuss Kant ideas on categorical imperative, in the second lecture we will discuss more on how he combines freedom, morality and autonomy together. And for Kant, the most important thing for individual is to be guided by a sense of duty without any consideration for the consequence of one's duty. So, he developed a very distinct sense of duty for the individual, which should be binding for them without any consideration for its consequences. So, through use of reason or what he calls categorical imperative, human being will have the knowledge of their duty, and once they understood it and had the courage of following it, they should not be guided by the consequences of their duty in performing what they think is their duty. More we will discuss on this idea when we will discuss categorical imperative. So, Kant combines freedom, morality and autonomy together and develop a very distinct sense of duty for the individual that is binding on them, and Kant in his personal life practiced this kind of philosophy as well. So, he emphasized that the individual's dignity and envisaged a society where everyone should be treated as an end in themselves and not for the means. So, in society many problems occurs because human beings treat each other, their friends, their fellow beings, their colleagues as a means for him or her to achieve certain ends, and that leads to a kind of instrumental use of human relationships or human association. In contrast to that, Kant argues that all individuals have dignity and every other members in the society must acknowledge and respect that dignity. By that he means that individuals should be treated as an end in themselves, not as a means for one to achieve certain other ends. Among the nation states also, he advocated a theory of perpetual peace and freedom without recourse to violence, and this we will discuss in the third lecture. He was also a strong advocate of republicanism and cosmopolitanism. However, there is a challenge in understanding or reading Kant, which is a very complex thinker, almost impenetrable even for the advanced learner, not to say about the beginners and the ordinary people. So, once you start reading Kant, you may find his ideas, the way he developed his arguments, somewhat cloudy in the sense of the range or the vastness of the subjects that he deals with. So, he remains somewhat impenetrable thinker, and in most of the universities, certainly at the undergrad level, you hardly find Kant being taught to the student. So, Kant remains a kind of impenetrable thinker even for the advanced learners, not to say about the beginners and the ordinary people. In this sense, he was truly a philosopher's philosopher, that is, for the advanced philosopher, Kant wrote his treatises. For our purpose in this course, we are going to focus on the secondary works on Kant and few of his newspaper articles and essays, and one of them is his newspaper article, What is Enlightenment, or what is Aufklärung, an answer to the question what is Aufklärung. So, that article we are going to discuss today in the second part of the lecture, but many of our discussion on Kant would be guided by the secondary literature that is available, besides few of his own writings, essays and articles in the newspapers, and also one of his texts, Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. So, we are going to deal with these texts on Kant, and through these texts we will try to understand Kant's views on enlightenment, categorical imperative, state, politics, individual freedom, autonomy and morality, and the theory of perpetual peace or kingdom of ends. So, these are some of the themes that we are going to discuss on Kant by looking at these texts. Now, if you look at the intellectual context of Kant, he was developing his philosophy in the context of enlightenment, which was already started with the scientific revolution in astronomy, physics, mathematics, or new modes of thinking about organizing individual and collective life. So, Kant was developing his philosophy in the context of enlightenment and scientific revolution in Europe, and there was also the French Revolution, which had tremendous influence on political discourse across the continent. So, most of the European states were ruled by monarchy, and French Revolution established the desire for a republican form of government. So, it was a kind of transition time, so to say, from one modes of thinking and organizing one's life individually and collectively to acquiring new modes of thinking, theorization about knowledge, self, other, society and politics as well. So, there was a kind of growing belief in science and reason for solving the challenges that humanity faced. So, it was also a time when human beings began to believe in the value of science and reason, and that is in some ways shaped our modernity. So, in belief, in faith or in religious dogmas or spirituality, in contrast to that, modern ways of thinking about knowledge, self, society, community, politics, economy, science, progress, so on, is guided by a kind of limitless faith in science and reason. So, human beings for the first time during this era of enlightenment began to believe in the value of science and reason as the source or as the tool for solving all the challenges that humanity faced. Francis Bacon established the authority of science by arguing that knowledge is power. So, to lead a good life or a dignified life, one needs to have the knowledge, and knowledge empowers. Knowledge gives power to the individual, to the society, and there has to be a kind of scientific basis of all forms of knowledge. So, Francis Bacon started this movement which is called establishing the authority of science. Similarly, Descartes established the authority of reason by arguing that human beings are rational and thinking subject, and there lies a kind of differentiation of human species from the other species on the planet. So, in comparison to say animals or other species, human beings are considered to be endowed with reason and rationality. Thereby, human beings are thinking beings, and that enables them to control or shape the prospect that is there in individual's life. So, Descartes believed that human beings are rational and thinking subject. They can think and reason out their existence. So, human beings are capable of, through the use of reason, shaping the prospect of his life or achieving progress individually and also at the collective level by organizing the society in a better manner on the rational principle, thereby achieving prosperity and bringing about all around enlightenment in the life of humanity. So, these ideas of human beings as a rational or thinking subject are encapsulated in his famous dictum. Here is Rene Descartes, that is, I think, therefore I am. So, the very definition or understanding of human being is based on this idea that human existence and identity is based on the fact that they are thinking being, and the ability of think makes a man what they call rational, enlightened man, so to say. So, the French philosopher Voltaire similarly was synonymous with enlightenment thinking. So, Kant was developing his philosophy in this context where there is excessive reliance or trust in the value of science and reason. Although enlightenment has many traditions within, so one of the thinkers we have discussed in this course, that is Rousseau, was very critical of the excessive use of reason, belief in science and arts as the basis of human progress. He was very skeptical of those kind of values and also regarded as the enlightenment thinker. And Kant similarly, while acknowledging the role of reason and rationality, also established the limits of human knowledge. So, his critique of pure reason, practical reason and judgment all address this question of human reason, rationality and knowledge, the way it operates or function and their limits. So, enlightenment has many traditions within. However, they all argued that all knowledge should be subjected to rational scrutiny. And what does it mean by rational scrutiny, especially in the time of social media, let us say, where all kinds of facts are presented to us, and it is very difficult for us to separate the fact from fiction, and it is easy to believe the prevalent dogmas or strong beliefs that exist in the society. Now, these enlightenment thinkers argued it was also there when there was a kind of religious modes of thinking about planetary system, about human life, the place of earth and so on. In contrast to that modes of knowledge and thinking, these enlightenment thinkers believe that all knowledge must be subjected to rational scrutiny. That means challenging every beliefs, dogmas, practices in the society in the light of reason, and the knowledge is based on this critical rational scrutiny of all forms of knowledge. Now, parallel to the rationalist, there were also empiricists who proclaimed that all knowledge emanates not from human reason, which is independent, but what they call human experience. So, major figures of these empiricist school were David Hume, Locke and many others. And Locke argued that all knowledge begins with human experience, and if you recall our lecture on Locke, we have discussed that how human understanding is based on human experience. So, contrary to the rationalist belief in human reason and rationality, Locke and other empiricists argue that individual mind is a blank slate or tabula rasa, which is then made to rationalize the self and the world based on the human experience which human acquired throughout his life. So, human understanding and knowledge is not something that emanates from his reason, that is independent of his context or experience. Rather, it is based on the empirical existence or the experience of human beings. So, David Hume was the major proponent of this empiricist school of thought. Thus, they argued about the limits of reason alone as the source of knowledge. So, in contrast to the rationalist, empiricists argued about the role of human experience as the source of their knowledge or understanding of self or the other in the society. So, there is a kind of clear divide between the rationalist and their focus on reason and rationality, and empiricists their focus on material context and the human experience as the source of knowledge. It led to a kind of growing demand for unity or the wholeness of human subject, their context, their source of knowledge or true knowledge. And rationalists following Descartes created a many distinction or differences between say soul and the body. So, mind and body kind of distinction, or reason and feeling. So, in modernity there is also this divide that to be enlightened you need to be rational, and to be rational is to do away with your feelings and emotions or passions. So, this kind of dichotomy create a kind of divide in the human subjectivity and leads to many contradictions in the society. So, there is a kind of demand for unifying these differences, these categorical differentiation between mind and body, soul and the body, reason and the feeling, reason from the imagination, thought from senses, desire from the cold instrumental calculation through reason and so on. So, rationalist engagement with the reason and subjecting all forms of knowledge to this rational scrutiny leads to this kind of differentiation, and against that there was a demand for a kind of unified or a kind of whole understanding of human subject and human society. So, excessive reliance on reason led to skepticism, that means you doubt everything, every prevalent customs, traditions, values, norms in the society. You are skeptical to everything basically, and you accept only those things which pass the rational test, which is you subject the dogmas, practices that is prevalent in the society through reason, and once it passed that test then you accept it. That means you are skeptical to all forms of authority, orders, norms in the society. So, the excessive reliance on reason led to skepticism, and similarly exclusive focus on experience had led to materialism, that what exists is only matter. So, Kant and his transcendental philosophy of ethics, epistemology and metaphysics transcend such dichotomies between the two, and it is encapsulated in no matter, no mind. There cannot be a kind of sharp distinction between mind and the body, matter and the reason. There is a kind of dialogic relationship between the two. So, on the one hand you have in Kant a kind of decisive establishment of reason as the only source of knowledge, and at the same time also explaining the limits of that knowledge. There would be the world which would be inaccessible to human perception or human imagination. That world is called phenomena, that is things in itself, and this we will discuss in the next class. So, here what one needs to understand that Kant's transcendental philosophy tries to transcend the dichotomies that exist between the materialist and the empiricist and the rationalist. Now, if you look at the personal life of Immanuel Kant, which was a kind of very boring, if you like, or a kind of dull life. It was all set beforehand, and Kant subjected himself merely to following those daily routine. So, Kant was born in Königsberg in Prussia in 1724. He had a humble origin, and his family was said to settled in Prussia from who migrated from Scotland 100 years before the birth of Kant, and except for a brief period for tutoring in a nearby village, Kant never left his native city, that is Königsberg. So, he had his education and spent all his life in this city without moving out of that city even for once. And he had great interest in anthropology, geography, territories, different lands, countries and so on. But he never in his life moved out of his native city, where he died in 1804. And Kant's parents were pietists who believed in the strict observance of religious practices and beliefs, and it was perhaps this influence on Kant in his early childhood, particularly from his mother, that Kant, although outgrew the religious teachings in his adult life, but never lost trust in faith, even when he argued that reason is the basis of true knowledge, and that we will see how he developed those ideas, while like Rousseau had not rejected the faith or intuitive understanding or human passion and so on. So, Kant in that sense was a very complex thinker to frame him either as a rationalist or someone like Rousseau, counter Enlightenment thinker. So, he remains a quintessential Enlightenment thinker, but in his own way, in many complex strains of thought is there in his critique, the most famous like critique of pure reason, practical reason and judgment. In 1755, Kant was appointed as a private lecturer at the University of Königsberg, the same city where he lived and studied. He was made a full professor of logic and metaphysics in 1770, and he turned out to be a great teacher and most distinguished professor at the university, and there used to be a great admiration for his teachings, the way he used to explain concepts, thinkers and ideas in the class, and Herder wrote about those things in his memoirs of Kant and his method of teaching. So, he was a great teacher and really developed his philosophical articulation much later in his life at the age of 57. So, he was also a good conversationalist who loved to surround himself with friends, but he led a kind of isolatory life and almost feared any kind of intimate relationship or interference from the other. So, Kant lived a very meticulously organized and disciplined life, and every activity in his life had a fixed timing. One of the biographers wrote that his daily routine was like a series of verbs: rising, coffee drinking, writing, lecturing, dining and walking. So, most of his life Kant followed this routine meticulously without deviating from it. So, he used to rise early in the morning, had coffee, used to prepare the notes or write his lectures, then giving the lecture, dining and walking. That was the daily routine of Kant. He was so punctual in following this routine that it is said that his neighbor used to set their clock by observing Kant's activity. So at 3:30 he used to go for a walk. So every one in his neighborhood would know by looking at Kant or his work that it is 3:30. So he was so meticulous, disciplined in following the routine. Chief of them was his post-dinner works among the linden trees, which is still known as philosopher's work. His life was exclusively devoted to the pursuit of knowledge, and he was trying to understand and explain the limits and the functions of knowledge. As I said in the beginning of this lecture, the primary concern for Kant was to understand what is the functioning or operation of knowledge and what was its limits. So what are the things that human beings can possibly know, and what are the things that will remain outside the domain of human knowledge. He used to accomplish the tasks he set for himself by sheer perseverance. Once he started a task, no matter how much time it would take, but he would accomplish it. He was so preoccupied with the pursuit of knowledge, its source, limits and functioning, that he considered marriage as a distraction and source of corruption, and therefore he never married. In fact, on two occasions he came closer to have it, but he took so much time. So every action in Kant's life was based on thorough consideration and reflection about the consequences of those actions. So he used to take a long time before he commit to something or set a task for himself, and once he said that, without consideration of its consequences, he used to accomplish it. So it is about the marriage also. He took so much time that it never materialized. So during the Kant times, Königsberg became a center of enlightenment, particularly during the reign of Frederick the Great and his able Minister of Education, von Zeldlich. However, there was a kind of decisive shift from this Enlightenment approach of Frederick the Great and his education minister von Zeldlich. During the reign of his successor Frederick William II and his Minister of Education Wöllner, who believed in the role of religion and religious beliefs in organizing the life. So the successor of Frederick the Great wanted to re-establish religion and censored any publication which was critical to religion or faith. So the Enlightenment thinking, if you like, which believes in the reason, their main target was the religious dogmas and beliefs. So they wanted all forms of religious dogmas and beliefs to be subjected to rational critical scrutiny. Now these successor of Frederick the Great wanted to re-establish the religion and therefore censored any publication that was critical to religion or faith. So his education minister Wöllner wrote against Kant to the king, which forced Kant to take a pledge that he would not engage in any discussion on religion publicly through writing or teaching. Kant lived a life of the mind truly and passionately. He overcame many of his physical frailties and continues to give lectures toward the end of his life. So he lived his life according to the principle that is mentioned in his Critique of Practical Reason, that is, two things fill the heart with the renewed and increasing awe and reverence. These are the starry firmament above and the moral law within. So the source of moral law for Kant is not outside. So there is a kind of starry firmament above and the moral law within. These are the two major source of guiding human action, human knowledge, human understanding, and how society organize its life collectively, and how peace can be maintained or achieved among the community of the nation or states. So this idea of the two principle sums up his philosophy of morality, autonomy and freedom as well, which we are going to discuss in the next lecture. Despite living under a monarchy, Kant was also a great admirer of French Revolution and republican values. So Kant wrote his first major work, that is philosophical work, which is called Critique of Pure Reason in 1781 at the age of 57. So no philosopher took so much time to articulate and write his first treatises at the ripe age of 57. And in the next 10 years, he wrote epoch-making works in philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology and ethics, such as groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, which was a kind of preparatory work to the other works on morality, that he wrote in 1785. Critique of Practical Reason was written in 1788 and Critique of Judgment was written in 1790. So he contributed to other areas as well, but his major concern was this Critique of Pure Reason, Critique of Practical Reason and Critique of Judgment. These are the three major works which outlines the functioning and the limits of knowledge and human reason and rationality. Besides them, Kant also contributed to other areas such as politics, arts, religion, faith and so on. However, his chief concern was to examine the operation and limits of reason, rationality and human knowledge, and in doing so he rescued reason from skepticism and faith from blind worshipping and submission. So to say, for religion also or for faith, he provided a kind of rational basis rather than blind following or blind worshipping. He did not write any major political treatises, and most of his political ideas that we will discuss are scattered in his numerous newspaper articles and essays. Now let us discuss this idea of enlightenment or the age of reason. This term enlightenment is usually referred to the age of reason. So what is enlightenment? Basically it is the age of reason. That means reason, rationality is the only source of knowledge or only basis of any true knowledge. However, when you look at the enlightenment tradition in Europe, it covers several ideas and intellectual tradition and was made up of various and often conflicting strains of thought. So there was difference between German enlightenment, from French enlightenment to Scottish enlightenment, and there was various strands of thought in within this overall project of enlightenment. However, what binds these enlightenment thinkers together was an attitude of mind and a mood rather than a common body of ideas in which human reason and self-actualization were given primacy over other things. So in all the enlightenment thinkers, what you will find is the primacy of individual and how that individual will actualize his self or herself through the use of reason, and that was given primacy to everything else. So even the political organization, state, nation, community, economy should pave the way for the individual to actualize his self or herself, and that is in a way sums up the whole modernity project. That is the state, market, economy, community, everything is there for the self actualization of individual, and only that individual are capable of actualizing himself or herself who are capable of or daring enough to use his her own reason rather than guiding by the reason or other guardian classes, and this we will discuss when we will discuss Kant's views on enlightenment. So that sums up the varied varied strands of thought that is there in the enlightenment, that they give primacy to the human reason and the self actualization over everything else. So growth of self consciousness, increasing awareness of power of man's mind, to subject himself and the world to rational analysis was the dominant feature of enlightenment. So, if you try to understand what was enlightenment, it was this growing self awareness or increasing understanding or faith in human mind that would subject himself or the world to the rational analysis. The faith in the power of reason to investigate successfully not only nature but also man and society was the dominant feature of enlightenment. And this was this feature which helps human being to take control of his her life. So, in the beginning, especially if you look at physics or natural sciences, their idea is how to use nature or control or tame the nature through say engineering or other domain of scientific knowledge is to achieve human control or mastery over nature. But enlightenment is not just about human mastery or control or taming of nature, but also how to organize society and self according to the rational principle, and that is the whole motto of enlightenment. They argue that not only politics be subjected to rational scrutiny, but political arrangements and institutions could be reconstituted along the rational lines as well. So, the whole basis of state and the government in modern time is based on the consent of the people, and these people as individual are considered to be rational, knowing what is in their best interest and therefore choosing the government which is best suitable to serve their interest. So, the whole political arrangements in a way is based on this enlightenment thinking of human being or the power of human reason as the source of human action for organizing the life in a better manner, which will provide the individual a space for self actualization and so on. So, the critical attitude towards authority, particularly religious authority, led to constant questioning of all accepted values, particularly those of the religious values and beliefs. So, what brings enlightenment, what brings the age of reason is the constant scrutiny or challenge to all forms of authority, all forms of beliefs or prevalent dogmas and so on. So, the creative fusion of scientific investigation, the Cartesian transformation of philosophy and classical revival shaped the discourse of enlightenment. Scientific revolutions such as Copernicus and Kepler in astronomy, Galileo and Newton in physics, Descartes and Leibniz in mathematics was significant as it emphasized the point that the human observation and evidence should be the basis of all knowledge, and it is not just applied to science and scientific inquiry, but also in the domain of philosophy and the knowledge of society or human self. Now, Kant particularly defines enlightenment and becomes a kind of synonymous figure with enlightenment or rationality project, and he is rightly regarded as the most explicit and articulate exponent of enlightenment tradition in Europe, and he defined enlightenment in a very distinct and particular way, which was very definite from say the empiricist led materialism and the rationalist led skepticism before Kant. So, there was a agreement on the use of human reason and science as the basis of true knowledge, but there was also a kind of diversion or differences between the empiricist or the rationalist, between the skepticism and the materialism and so on. But Kant provided a very definite answer to what is enlightenment for the individual being and how one can achieve enlightenment at the collective level, at the level of society. So, Kant defined enlightenment as human beings coming out of their self imposed immaturity condition, and this point we need to discuss, right. It is convenient for us to be guided by the existing practices, values and norms in the society, and in doing so we do not take the trouble, and there is no danger of encountering anyone in the society, and we just follow the norms that is prevalent in the society, that could not bring about enlightenment. And human beings live mostly a kind of slave life or a subject life to the pre-existing norms and values in the society. That man cannot be the enlightenment, and without man being enlightened, how we can bring enlightenment at the collective level, or how we can bring about the enlightened age. So Kant defined enlightenment as human beings' capability or daring or courage to come out of their self-imposed in a sense that nobody tells them to do that, but they just follow it because it is prevalent, it is convenient. Why to think, why to critically engage with the prevalent norms and practices in the society, and thereby endangering one's life or endangering the prospect of one's life. So it is easy, convenient to lead one's life according to the prevalent notion and norms. So this immaturity condition, that is to be dependent on the norms and values that is set by others in the society, and you do not really engage rationally, critically with forming the imperative that will guide your action. So this condition then of dependent to norms and the values that is set by others in the society is immaturity condition, and this immaturity condition is self-imposed, and man cannot be enlightened if they live in this self-imposed immaturity condition. So enlightenment for man, according to Kant, is their ability to come out of this self-imposed immaturity condition. So this immaturity condition, according to Kant, are not the result of lack of knowledge or understanding. So it is not that human beings do not understand which norms are bad, which norms are good, which norms are desirable or undesirable. It is simply their lack of courage to follow what they think is right. So it is in the lack of determination and courage to use one's own reason, understanding or knowledge without the assistance of another. So the motto of enlightenment, according to Kant, is therefore this sapere aude, that is dare to know. Know for yourself. Do not understand something because it is said by others, or it is said by the society, or simply it is dominant in the society or accepted by the majority in the society. You must base all your knowledge, all your understanding through your own reason. So sapere aude, that is dare to know, becomes the motto of enlightenment, that is have the courage to use your own understanding and not the understanding that is prevalent in the society. So Kant was a strong advocate of public use of reason or rationality to bring about enlightenment and progress at the collective level. So Kant makes a kind of then distinction between the private or the public use of reason, and without entering into chaos or anarchy because of excessive use of reason that leads to skepticism and also critique of all forms of social political authority. To avoid that, he makes a very clear and ambiguous in a way distinction between public and private sphere of life. So he argues that a great portion of man remains in the lifelong condition of immaturity because it is convenient, it is easy. Once you use your reason and then you subject your action according to that reason or understanding, will create trouble with others in the society. But if you follow the norms that is prevalent in the society, then life is easy, much more convenient, and the society will remain as they are. Now to bring about enlightenment is to use one's reason and have the courage to abide by or follow that reason. So a great portion of man, according to Kant, remains in the lifelong condition of immaturity, and it almost becomes their nature. Why they do it? Just it is prevalent in the society and followed by majority in the society, not because their mind or their rational thinking intellect tells them it is right. So according to Kant, no revolution can change this condition except freedom, and freedom he defines in a very distinct sense. It is to use reason publicly in all matters without restraints. So, however, he also argued that unrestrained use of reason and rationality could lead to chaos or anarchy in the society, and to avoid that he makes a distinction between private and public use of reason, and he allowed unrestrained use of reason or rational faculty on public matters. So, in personal capacity or in personal sphere of life, individual must obey the laws and established procedure, but publicly as a scholar intellectual he should have complete freedom to scrutinize those actions, those procedures. So, let us take the example, one can question the text authority in public because of excessive tax and so on, or the challenges or the limits of that tax system. However, so long such tax laws exist, that person must pay the tax. Let us think of this public and private in other ways. So, suppose one individual is in army, and when in operation as an army man, he must obey the command of his superiors. But as a scholar, that means as a public person, as an intellectual, he should have unrestrained freedom to criticize the command of his commander. Now, that becomes a kind of ambiguous. How the same person can lead this dual life of a private, personal, professional life of an army man or a clergy or XYZ in the administrative structure of the society. But the same man then should also publicly, as the scholar or the intellectual, express his opinion about a particular action or the particular text or the particular procedure or the particular laws to bring about enlightenment at the collective level. So, I mean, it is a kind of paradox that you have seen in Rousseau's thought. Man is born free, but everywhere he is in the chains. Man can be free, and that freedom can be achieved by forcing the man to follow the general will. Similarly, in Kant also he acknowledged the existence of paradoxes in the society. So, he wants the use of reason, but excessive use of reason may lead to chaos and anarchy. To prevent that, one has to make a kind of delicate balance between the personal life as a citizen, as a army man, as a clergy or what XYZ in the administrative structure, but as a public person, as the scholar and intellectual, he or she should have unrestrained freedom to criticize any laws, any actions, and there should not be any limits to such public exercise of reason. And this is this public use of reason that would bring about enlightenment in the society and progress in the society. So, to the question whether we live in the enlightened age where there is unrestrained freedom to use reason publicly on all matters, Kant's answer was a categorical no. We do not live in the enlightened age. Enlightened age is you achieve that stage in society where there is unrestrained freedom to use reason publicly on all matters. We do not live or have achieved that stage of life, because there is so much of dogmas, so much of prevalent notions, rules that guides or curtails that freedom to use reason publicly. So, his answer that whether we live in an enlightened age or not, his answer was clearly no. Nonetheless, he agreed that we do live in the age of enlightenment. So, there is a distinction between enlightened age, that is you achieve certain stage of life where it is permitted to use your reason in all matters publicly. Enlightenment is the age where you subject all forms of knowledge to human rational scrutiny, to rational scrutiny. So, he argued that so long there are hindrances and obstacles to the public use of reason, enlightenment could not be achieved. So, or enlightened age could not be achieved. It is only possible when we remove those hindrances and obstacles. So, in many societies, particularly those in the authority or in the position of authority, whether it is the religious authority or the political authority or even in the scientific inquiry certain paradigms, if you operates within paradigms, they will not allow you to argue something which challenge the very basis. However, the knowledge progress when there is unrestrained freedom of thought and expression of those thoughts. So, enlightenment is about that in every sphere of life, public, political, economic, social and so on. Now, to remove those restraints that is cherished by those who are in the position of power and authority, they do not want all kind of opinion to be expressed, because that may endanger their authority. So, think about the church or the religious authority against whom all these kind of intellectual development was taking place, which challenged the very foundation of religious knowledge and religious argument. So, there was restraints or hindrance to allow human beings to express their opinion publicly on all matters. And to remove those restraints, Kant wanted absolute freedom for the citizens as scholars, as a public person or intellectuals. He should be free to express his opinion publicly on all matters. There should not be any kind of restraints. Now, one could ask this question whether society as a whole can achieve enlightenment. Its answer is debatable, because man being man will be guided by their own subjective, historical, political context and not necessarily use their reason to develop his own understanding, and even when they have their own understanding, they may lack the courage to follow them. And so long as they lack that courage, one cannot bring about enlightenment, even at the individual level, and it is even tough to bring about enlightenment at the collective level, at the level of society. So, Kant envisioned a very different kind of society and individuals, where individuals will be moral, autonomous and free to use his her reason, and they would treat each other as an end in themselves, thereby recognizing the dignity of each. It would be, according to Kant, a kingdom of perpetual peace, where man would be guided by their moral sense of duty, which they set for themselves through the use of reason. So, there is a kind of deontological basis or a kind of self legislation of those laws which governs individual action, and this we will discuss in the next class while discussing categorical imperative. So, thus for attainment of enlightenment, Kant argued for the complete and unrestrained freedom of thought on public matters, but he did so in a manner that individual would be guided by their moral and rational sense of duty rather than personal interest that we see in modern industrial society. So, that is all in this lecture today. To read some of the text on Kant and to know more about his personal life, his philosophical treatises and particularly his views on enlightenment, you can refer to some of these texts like Gary Browning, which is a kind of interpretation of his views on enlightenment, his views on knowledge, reason and rationality. So, Gary Browning you can refer to, the title of the text is A History of Modern Political Thought, the Question of Interpretation. Paul Guyer is a very good compilation of articles on Kant, which is the Cambridge Companion to Kant and Moral Philosophy. Ottfried Hoff, you can read Immanuel Kant, which is translated by Marcel Ferrier. You can read certainly this text by Immanuel Kant, What is Enlightenment? It is just a 3-page newspaper article, and the discussion that we have had is based on this particular text, What is Enlightenment. In Mary J. Greger edited Immanuel Kant, Practical Philosophy, Cambridge University Press. You can also refer to Immanuel Kant, Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, and Hans Ries is a very good text on Kant's political writings, and Roger Scruton, Kant's a very short introduction. You can read to understand more about Kantian views on enlightenment, his personal life, and many of other topics that we will discuss on Kant. So, that is all in this lecture today. Do share your views and feedback. We will be very happy to respond. Thanks for listening.